For our next talk, we have Bryn Rhodes from Smile Digital Health and Tang from Google.
All right, welcome. Thank you. Next slide. I have no idea how Macs work. So I'm Bryn Rhodes. I'm a Director of Standard Strategy at Smile Digital Health, also a co-chair of the CDS Working Group, where we steward a bunch of the standards that are kind of underpinning some of this work. I'm
Jing. I'm a software engineer at Google, based in London. I work on Open Health Stack and Android FHIR SDK.
All right, so we're going to hopefully do a very high-level bit about translating CPGs to executable content, which is kind of what the demo app that we're going to show is doing or taking advantage of. We're going to learn about Open Health Stack and Android FHIR SDK and understand specifically the knowledge manager and workflow library components of that SDK, and then get to a demo. So we've been working on, if you're familiar with the Clinical Practice Guidelines Implementation Guide, it's an approach to representing practice guidelines in computable form, specifically as FHIR and CQL resources. So one of the ways that we approach that problem is by looking at knowledge representation in terms of levels. So level 1 is narrative content. This is like unstructured text. It's dense. It's typically the way that clinical practice guidelines are published today. Then level 2 is semi-structured, so you're starting to get into things like flow diagrams. This is for human readable communication, but it's still probably not actually computable. And so L3 is where we get to actual structured, machine readable representation. But importantly, L3 is still platform independent. So we have a representation that's computable, but it's not tied to any particular implementation. Whereas L4 is where you're talking about knowledge that's actually implemented and running in a system. So if you take those structured representations and you plot those against kind of the classic 3 tiers of architecture, you've got your data layer, your logic layer, and a presentation layer. Then at each of those intersections, you get different kinds of artifacts that would appear in those intersections. So if you look at the presentation layer in L1, that's like a user story, just the flat-out description of a user story. At L2, that might be a flow diagram or a wireframe. At L3, that's a questionnaire, like a FHIR resource that actually structures the questionnaire in the presentation layer. And at L4, that's actually a smart app running and you're entering the data. So L3 is where CPG, the Clinical Practice Guideline IG, is focused. And the idea is you can take a computable guideline, express it in these L3 artifacts, and then run those in an engine that understands those computable artifacts, which is what we're going to demo. So one of the things CPG does is try to break down the computable practice guidelines into the kinds of activities that you can direct as part of directed care. So you can send a message, you could collect information with a questionnaire, you could order a medication, and these are all the kind of grammar of a CPG, and you break down and provide FHIR resources that conform to these profiles to describe things like when some condition is true, prescribe a particular medication. Next slide. We also build on, if you're familiar with the workflow pattern in FHIR, it has the definition pattern, the request pattern, like all the service requests, medication requests, to model the actual requests going from plans to orders, and then the actual events like medication dispense or medication administration that represents the event side of that request. And so we build on that pattern in the CPG to define for each of those activities how they move through that set. So you get it as a proposal from decision support. That becomes a plan when you agree to do it. It becomes an order when it's authorized by a physician, and then it's actually performed as part of the delivery of that care. And so one of the example content IGs here that we've put together is the WHO Smart Guidelines Measles Immunization. So this is a subset of the entire immunization, WHO immunization guideline, expressed and focused on just measles immunization. So it's got a few plan definitions that are just related to the decision support for that. And it's kind of an exemplar IG to demonstrate what this looks like. And then we go to open
Swap places. All right, thanks, Bryn. All right, so my part of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about Open Health Stack, Android FHIR SDK, the libraries that we have built, and then I'm going to do a demo at the end, so fingers crossed. So quickly on Open Health Stack, you might have heard this from the other presentations, from maybe Bashir's presentation. So it's a set of open source components that we have built to help developers create next generation FHIR-based healthcare applications. We have a dev site, ohs.dev. Maybe I should be somewhere, I don't know. Yeah, we have a dev site, ohs.dev. There's a lot more information, so please have a look if you're interested. We have 3 main components in Open Health Stack. The first one is Android FHIR SDK, which is the focus today. We introduced it at DevDays 2 years ago in Cleveland. There's a presentation done by Fred, linked here, so feel free to go and have a look. And last year, Bashir introduced the FHIR data pipes, which is the analytics pipeline that allows developers to take FHIR data and run analytics on top of it and create dashboards. There was a DevDays talk last year as well. And then yesterday, Bashir had another talk on FHIR Information Gateway, which is a generic access control proxy that can sit in front of any FHIR server. Right, so the idea very quickly of Open Health Stack components is that you can really pick and choose the different libraries and components and either complement your existing system or perhaps you're building a new FHIR system with your choice of FHIR store, either in the cloud or maybe using Happy, whatever you want. You can put these things together using the Open Health Stack components. We have some use cases and user stories and developer resources, demos, example apps, all linked from the dev site, link at the bottom. Right, so the focus today, as I mentioned, is the Android FHIR SDK. So I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about this. It's a set of Kotlin libraries for building Android apps using FHIR. Right, so we know that this capability exists on the server side, and I know DevDays is very much sort of, there's a focus on the server side components. But we think, on mobile devices, there's actually a unique opportunity to use FHIR data, especially to deliver care to patients who probably don't have access by using, community healthcare programs, using community health workers who deliver care to remote communities. So that's why we started building the Android FHIR SDK a few years ago. So now we have 4 components. The first one, and probably the most mature one, is the structured data capture library, the SDC library. So with this library, you can take FHIR questionnaires and then generate Android UI. We have found that this is a really, really huge kind of a productivity boost for developers. Android devs really love this, to take FHIR resources that's been authored already and then create the Android apps. The second library, FHIR Engine, is probably the most fundamental library, I guess. Essentially, it's you could think about it as a FHIR server on Android. But obviously, it's not a FHIR server because it's programmatically kind of compiled into your application. But the main part of it is actually this FHIR relational database that we have built in SQLite. And then you have the data access API, search API, sync API on top of that for your application to use FHIR data. Right? So the search API is kind of inspired by the FHIR RESTful search API, but obviously this is a programmatic API, so your app can actually call the Kotlin APIs and search for your patient resources that's stored on device. And Sync API does the thing of synchronizing with a backend FHIR server, both download and upload. Most relevant to today's demo are the Knowledge Manager and Workflow Library. The Knowledge Manager basically handles the storage and processing of knowledge artifacts, which is the clinical guideline stuff that Bryn just talked about. And the workflow library basically applies those guidelines to aid your workflow by sort of loading the patient data as well and applying the guidelines on top of that. So putting all these libraries together, how you build an Android app using the SDK components. Obviously, you would have your application-specific logic, UI, maybe you have your login screen, your workflow on top of that. But we hope that by providing the 4 libraries as the foundation of your application, we have simplified some of your workflow in terms of creating Android apps. Obviously, the FHIR SDK libraries will be talking to the FHIR server and also the knowledge repository as described by FHIR IG. We also have a few demo apps on the GitHub repo. So if you want to check it out, you can go and build the apps and install them on your Android apps, on your Android device yourself. There's a main demo app that sort of showcases the data access, search, and sync APIs. And we also have a SDC catalog app that showcases the UI widgets we've built, the different sort of layouts in the SDC that we have implemented, but also the kind of form behavior such as like skip logic or expressions. Each of them is a specific example in the demo, in the catalog app. And then finally, there's this workflow demo app that Bryn and I were just talking about sort of yesterday. I think this is now going to be a work in progress. Hopefully, we'll convert some of the content of this talk into another very simple demo app for developers to use. Right, so now I'm going to spend really quickly a few minutes on the knowledge manager as well as the workflow library. So as I said, knowledge manager specifically in our case is to address the storage of definitional resources, which is the sort of clinical guidelines, right? So these resources are very different from the patient resources, and that's why we decided to build a separate library. They tend to be bigger, they can be binary data. You normally only download them, and then you never really need to edit the guideline information on device. So we have a separate library as knowledge manager to handle this data, so we don't store the same data on the patient sort of FHIR store. It has 3 components. The NPM package manager downloads guidelines from the knowledge repository, and then we have an index, database index to index the clinical resources which are saved in file format. So essentially, this is kind of like a CRMI client, right, that talks with the knowledge repository and handles the storage and local processing of the knowledge resources or clinical guidelines. And then finally, the workflow library is this library that we have built with a dependency to the clinical reasoning module that the AFRO team from SMILE have created. Essentially, it supports clinical decision support and also supports some basic measure generation. So you can run a very simple kind of a measure report on Android. So the APIs that we have built are the apply API to generate a care plan, but also evaluate measure. And we are also building the activity flow, which is the diagram that Bryn showed earlier. So now, very quickly, we're going to do a demo. But just before the demo, I'm just going to sort of talk about where it came from. So basically, last year, we had this meeting in Kigali that's organized by the World Health Organization, where software developers as well as kind of content guideline authors came together to try to run smart guidelines and demonstrate that we can run them on a mobile device. So this is the result of that very exciting meeting. Right, so now I'm going to try to mirror the screen. So on the right-hand side is the Android screen of my device. So it's running the IG Smart Immunization, which is a sample IG that Bryn and co-authors have put together. So if I go to register new patient, so now immediately this is a questionnaire rendered by the SDC library. I'm going to just create a random patient. Because it's immunization IG, so I'm just going to create a baby. Right. So once I submit this patient, what happens here is that actually the application takes the questionnaire response and does an extraction, which I think Brian is going to talk about later, to convert the response into a patient resource, which is saved to the database in the FHIR engine that I talked about before. Right. So now if we go to the patient list, I actually created 2 patients before, but James, did I do Adam Smith? I think I created Adam Smith, right? Yeah. So this is a 1-month-old baby. You can see some of this data put out of the database, right? The ID, which is we generated UUID with date of birth 1st of May, and then it's a boy. So now if we go to the care plan activities, because of the clinical guidelines that we have stored already in this application, it has generated immunization review task. So in this case, I'm not going to actually do anything because this is all optional. I'm just going to try to get to the immunization workflow itself. So when I did the submit questionnaire, so what happens now is the workflow library is running the care guidelines that has been downloaded to this app. And then once the update finishes, you will be able to see some new tasks here, right? So the complete activity, which is the one that I just finished, is the immunization review. But now we have the pending vaccination, which then if I click through, immediately I can accept or reject this proposal. Sorry, my laptop just slapped. All right, we're back. So once I accepted the proposal, you can see is, there's a word plan, which is converting the proposal to the plan stage, right? It's what Bryn talked about in the activity flow diagram. So now when I go to plan, I can then talk about contraindications for the patient. So as a health worker, you might need to take or untake this. In this case, we're going to go through the happy path. So I'm just going to submit again. And then you can see the plan now is completed in the completed activities. But then the measles vaccine task itself has become an order, right? Now, if I click through again, I can actually record data, which is the administration of the vaccine. I can pick date and time, so it happened today, and then I will complete this clinical workflow. Let's say the vaccine expires next month. Submit again. And now you can see the measles vaccine workflow has gone through proposal to plan to order and to completion. So this is how we kind of bring the clinical guidelines to life on Android using the libraries we have built in Android FHIR SDK. That's all. Thank you. Maybe we'll. Thanks. Maybe we'll come back and just talk about how to get in touch with us, and then if you want to come back, Bryn, and then we'll take some questions.
Yeah.
So basically, you can reach us on email, Zulip, GitHub, the WHO Smart Guidelines community, as well as the OHS developer community.
Yeah.
Right.
We have time for a few questions.
And so this is a great start for everything. Can you envision a time where you have it as a collaborative, so the provider will have, for the patient registration, a workflow where they could send it over to the patient to do their consent and then come back, in that form itself? How is the architecture set so that you can take external inputs for the things that aren't part of the guidelines?
Yeah, I can try to answer this first. I don't know if you have, maybe you can add to it. As I said, we have the sync API in the Android FHIR SDK. So what, in this particular case, architecture probably would be for you to download patient data, but then you can add other resources to the patient on device, which you can then sync back to the FHIR server. So I think the specific workflow, we'd have to test, as a system, you have to test and make sure that it all works, upload and download, but the capability is there for you to be able to do that.
Thanks, really great presentation. And then I'm sorry if I missed this. And then is the idea that the smart applications, I think you said, I guess a person could have a patient could have it on their device, a community health worker could have it on their device, a health provider organization, you know, hospital, clinic, could have it integrated with their EHR. Is that the way kind of the WHO is thinking about how these things are going to be used?
Yeah, we have actually implement partners who have built apps using Android FHIR SDK, using OHS components, and they have deployed these applications in a number of countries in Sub Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia with community health worker-backed sort of programs, right? So they are collecting a vast amount of data. I think we have registered millions of patients basically with these kind of deployments. And then the data, once collected, then they can, again, be synced with the FHIR server. But then there's a whole, the back-end complex sort of processes. You can have many different versions of that, right, depending on the system and requirements. But the problem we have addressed really is the connection between the client and the server here to enable you to basically bring a different device, a different endpoint to your system. In this case, Android. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.